June 15th, 1944. Kyushu, Empire of Japan. The sky was pale and cloudless, the kind of morning that made the sea below look like hammered silver. Lieutenant Hiroshi Tanaka adjusted the strap of his flight goggles and leaned into the throttle of his Nakajima Ki-84 Hayate, the Army's newest and most powerful fighter. The engine's roar filled the cockpit, a deep metallic hum that vibrated through his ribs. He had been scrambled at dawn, another unidentified contact approaching from the south. Routine, they said. Probably a reconnaissance flight or a lost B-24. But the tone of the radio order had been different, urgent, measured. His base commander had simply said, "Tanaka, intercept and report. Do not engage unless ordered." That was the first sign something was wrong. At 28,000 feet, his breath came short in the thin air. The Ki-84 was capable, but she strained here, her climb sluggish, her controls stiff. Tanaka scanned the horizon, eyes narrowing against the glare. For a long moment, there was nothing. Then, faintly, a glint. It moved differently, steady, unwavering. A silver dot high above, contrails stretching across the blue like chalk lines on glass. Tanaka blinked and looked again. It was enormous. "Control, this is First Lieutenant Tanaka. Visual contact. Altitude estimate, 10,000 meters. He reported into the static. There was silence, then disbelief. "Repeat, Tanaka. 10,000. "Yes, at least." He opened the throttle further, climbing into the sun, but the distance only grew. The aircraft above was not descending. It was cruising higher, faster, indifferent to pursuit. Even at full climb, the Hayate could barely reach 9,000 meters before its engine began to cough. Then he saw the markings. White stars inside blue circles, painted on wings the size of a small ship. 4 engines, twin rudders. The shape was unfamiliar, yet unmistakable. Tanaka's breath caught. It's American," he said softly. "But not like any bomber I've seen." The radio crackled with voices, shouts, questions, but he didn't answer. His eyes were locked on the massive machine cutting through the sky far above him. It gleamed in the sunlight, serene, invulnerable. For a moment the world fell silent, and then, faintly, he saw the bomb bay doors open. Moments later, distant flashes rippled below the horizon. Tiny, glittering dots over the southern coastline of Kyushu. He couldn't hear the explosions, but he could see the smoke rising, small and black against the pale sea. He knew, instinctively, what it meant. The Americans had built something new, something that changed the rules. The B-29, the first superfortress to strike Japan, had arrived. Tanaka turned his aircraft toward base, his heart pounding. He didn't yet understand how far that bomber had flown, or from where. But he knew what it meant. The sky above Japan was no longer there. He whispered into the radio, almost to himself. "We can't touch it." Back at the airfield, mechanics gathered around his plane as he climbed out, still dazed. The commander, Colonel Matsuo, met him on the tarmac. "Report." Tanaka removed his goggles slowly. "It was a new type, sir. 4 engines, high altitude, fast, too fast." Matsuo frowned. "You engaged?" "No, couldn't reach it." Matsuo said nothing for a long time. Then he turned toward the open hangar, where the rising sun emblem hung proudly from the rafters. "Then," he said quietly, "the war has entered a new sky." Outside, the faint rumble of distant explosions rolled across the island like thunder. The first B-29 raid on Japan had begun. By nightfall, the barracks at Omura Airfield were filled with rumors. Some claimed the mysterious bomber had come from Saipan. Others swore it had been launched from a carrier, but the most terrifying rumor of all, the one whispered by ground officers over maps and coffee, was that the enemy no longer needed to be close. They could strike Japan from across the ocean. Lieutenant Hiroshi Tanaka sat at the edge of his bunk, staring at his flight gloves. They still smelled faintly of oil and sweat. Across the room, other pilots murmured softly. Someone cursed the weather. Another laughed bitterly about American tricks. Tanaka said nothing. His mind replayed the same moment. The silver giant sliding through the sky, untouchable. A sergeant entered with a clipboard. Briefing, now. In the operations hut, the lights flickered. A large wall map of Japan stretched across one side, dotted with pins and red thread. The air smelled of cigarette smoke and damp paper. Colonel Matsuo stood before the map, arms folded, face drawn. "Gentlemen," he began, "this morning's raid was carried out by a new American bomber, the Boeing B-29 Superfortress." He tapped the map near the Marianas. Launched from bases in China, range over 3,000 miles. Altitude capability, 10,000 meters. The room fell silent. One pilot spoke up, disbelief edging his voice. 10,000? That's impossible. Nothing can reach that height. Matsuo nodded grimly. Ours cannot. Not yet. He motioned to the mechanic officer, who rolled out a grainy reconnaissance photo. Black shapes, tiny specks surrounded by cloud, floated above the curvature of the earth. Observation aircraft over Hankou captured this. The B-29 flies above our flak ceiling. Even our fastest interceptors struggle to climb that high before engines stall. He paused, scanning the faces before him. The Americans have built the sky we cannot reach. Tanaka felt something heavy settle in his stomach. He thought of the Ki-84, its engine coughing above 30,000 feet, its guns useless against a target so distant it might as well be a star. The colonel continued, his tone clipped, almost defiant. Command believes they will not risk large-scale raids yet. Their bases are far, supply lines long. We still hold Formosa and the Philippines. They will bleed for every kilometer they advance. But even as he spoke, Tanaka could hear doubt in his voice. When the meeting ended, the pilot stepped out into the cool night. The horizon glowed faintly to the south, fires still burning from the morning's raid. "Do you think we can stop them?" a young pilot asked quietly. Tanaka looked up. The stars were dim through the haze, scattered across the vast, uncaring sky. "Maybe," he said after a long pause. "But not with wings like ours." 2 weeks later, the impossible became routine. Air raid sirens howled over Kyushu and Shikoku as more superfortresses crossed the skies. Their approach was silent until the bombs fell. The deep, rolling thunder that followed shook cities hundreds of kilometers apart. Intercept missions became exercises in frustration. The radar would pick up the intruders, but by the time fighters reached altitude, the bombers were already vanishing into the stratosphere, leaving only contrails and drifting smoke. On July 7th, Tanaka led a formation of Ki-44 Tojo interceptors against a reported incoming raid. Climbing through scattered cloud, his altimeter ticked past 9,000 meters. His engine strained, vibrating under the effort. Sweat beaded beneath his oxygen mask. Then he saw them, a formation of B-29s, 30 strong, gliding through the sun like silver phantoms. Their formation was perfect, disciplined, symmetrical. Sunlight flashed off their wings like blades. Tanaka lined up a shot, but the distance was hopeless. His 12.7 mm machine guns barely reached half that range. He squeezed the trigger anyway, and a few tracers streaked upward before vanishing into empty air. "Too high!" his wingman shouted over the radio. "They're climbing again!" Tanaka cursed. The B-29s continued onward, unbothered, engines droning like thunder above the clouds. From his altitude, he could see them begin their bombing run. Doors opening, glints of light falling in lazy arcs toward the ground. He knew what followed. Factories, docks, and rail yards erupting into flame. And still, he could do nothing. That evening, back at the airfield, the squadron gathered in silence. Reports filtered in. Factories destroyed in Yawata. Steel production crippled. The Empire's industrial heart had been struck for the first time. Tanaka stood beside the runway as the last orange light faded over the hills. The world felt smaller now, the air colder. A mechanic approached with a cigarette. "They say Tokyo's next." Tanaka didn't respond. His eyes were fixed on the horizon, where the contrails from that morning's raid still hung in faint ribbons against the dying light. "They'll come," he said softly. "And when they do, nothing will stop them." For the first time, he understood. Not just the weapon, but the strategy behind it. The B-29 was not built to fight Japan. It was built to erase the distance that once protected her. It was not just a bomber. It was the end of isolation, the beginning of the end. November 24th, 1944. Tokyo, Japan. The sun had not yet risen, and already the air raid sirens wailed. Their mechanical cry echoed through narrow alleys and quiet courtyards, bouncing off the tiled roofs of homes that had never known war until now. Lieutenant Hiroshi Tanaka was awake before the alarms began. He'd been lying on his bunk in the barracks outside Tachikawa Air Base, staring at the ceiling fan spinning slowly in the dark. Sleep had become a stranger. "Scramble!" someone shouted from the hall. He was already up. Boots, gloves, oxygen mask. The motions came automatically. Outside, the sky was a bruised gray, the horizon just beginning to glow with the first light of dawn. "Report from Radar Command," an adjutant barked. "Multiple contacts approaching from the east. Estimated altitude, 9 to 10,000 meters. The words hit like a hammer. 10,000 meters. Again. Tanaka met the eyes of his wingman, Sergeant Nakano, a boy barely 20. The younger man's expression was half fear, half awe. "Do you think it's them, sir? The new ones?" Tanaka nodded grimly. "It's them." Minutes later, his Nakajima Ki-44 Tojo was rolling down the runway, its radial engine screaming. The thin morning light flashed across the fuselage, catching the red Hinomaru on the wings. As he climbed through the haze, the first sight of Tokyo spread beneath him, a patchwork of homes, temples, and factories. Steam rose from rail yards. Children clutched their mothers in doorways, watching the streaks of aircraft vanish into the clouds. At 8,000 meters, the oxygen hissed through his mask. He could feel the plane's limits, the controls heavy, the engine gasping in the thin air. And then he saw them. Far above, the sky shimmered with moving light. Dozens, no, hundreds, of silver specks, each trailing contrails that crossed and merged into a white lattice over Tokyo Bay. The B-29S. He keyed his radio. "Visual contact, north-northeast formation. At least 100 aircraft." Static answered him. The command frequency was jammed by interference. Intentional or accidental, it didn't matter. They were alone now. "Try to close distance," he shouted. "Attack from below." The squadron climbed as one, engines straining. The air grew thinner, colder. Frost crept along the inside of his canopy. He lined up a shot. Just one. But the range was hopeless. His tracers disappeared long before reaching the bombers. Then the first bombs fell. They tumbled lazily at first, dark specks falling from the white sky. Then they multiplied. Dozens becoming hundreds, each one a promise of fire. The explosions came seconds later. Deep, rolling concussions that shook the city. Columns of smoke and flame rose where the factories of Musashino once stood. Tanaka's eyes flicked down, watching the industrial district vanish in a storm of dust. For the first time, he saw Tokyo burn. "God help us." Nakano's voice cracked through the static. Tanaka didn't answer. His eyes were fixed on the bombers above. Their formation didn't waver, not even as flak bursts blossomed uselessly around them. The B-29S glided forward, serene, methodical, untouchable. One of the bombers trailed smoke briefly, hit by a lucky burst, but even then it stayed in formation. The discipline, the power of it, was mesmerizing. He understood suddenly what this meant, not just for Japan's defenses, but for its spirit. The empire had built its armies for islands and seas, for dogfights and duels. But this was a new kind of war. One fought in mathematics and altitude, in factories and fuel depots, in distances so vast the human heart could barely comprehend them. When he landed that afternoon, the airfield was chaos. Mechanics shouted, trucks raced between burning hangars, and the distant horizon glowed red from fires that refused to die. Tanaka climbed down from his cockpit, his knees trembling. His flight commander approached, face streaked with soot. "Report, Lieutenant." Tanaka stared past him at the distant smoke columns rising over Tokyo. "We couldn't reach them, not one." The commander's shoulders sagged. "Then the capital is defenseless." He nodded slowly. "Yes, sir. Against that, we are children with stones." That night, the fires from Musashino could still be seen from the base. The glow pulsed like an open wound beneath the clouds. Tanaka sat on a wooden crate, smoking in silence. Nakano joined him, eyes red from exhaustion. "They'll come again," the younger pilot said softly. "They always do," Tanaka replied. He exhaled, watching the smoke drift upward into the same sky that had once seemed infinite. Now it felt like a prison. For the first time, the thought crossed his mind. A quiet, treacherous whisper. "We cannot win." A week later, the Americans came again. This time, they didn't just bomb factories. They bombed cities. Nagasaki, Osaka, Kobe. One by one, the names of Japan's heartlands turned into reports of smoke and ruin. By December, every pilot in Tanaka's unit knew the truth. The B-29S could appear anywhere, anytime, and there was nothing they could do but watch the sky. Mechanics began sleeping beside their planes, ready to scramble at the first alarm. Anti-aircraft crews lined the coastlines, staring into the dark, waiting for ghosts. And through it all, the sound of the B-29's engines haunted them. A deep, steady thunder that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Even at night, when he lay in his bunk, Tanaka could still hear it. The endless hum, the sound of inevitability. He understood now what the Americans had built. Not just a bomber, but a symbol. The Superfortress didn't just destroy cities. It destroyed the illusion of safety. The war was no longer about battlefields. It was about endurance, about who could last longer beneath the weight of the sky. And as the months passed, even the most loyal officers began to wonder how much longer Japan could endure. March 9th, 1945, Tokyo. The night began like any other raid. Sirens, spotlights, the distant hum of engines somewhere beyond the horizon. But within an hour, the capital was a sea of fire. Lieutenant Hiroshi Tanaka stood atop the roof of the Army Communications Building, staring across the city he had sworn to protect. Tokyo was vanishing before his eyes. The B-29S had returned, not from China, but from the Marianas. Saipan, Tinian, Guam, names that had once seemed distant, irrelevant. Now they were launching pads of apocalypse. The bombers came not in dozens, but in hundreds. The roar of their engines merged into a single, endless note, like the voice of some vast machine. At 2,000 meters above the city, their bomb bay doors opened, not to drop explosives, but something worse. Napalm and magnesium, firebombs that ignited the very air. Within minutes, entire districts were aflame. The wind carried burning debris across the Sumida River, spreading the fire faster than any defense could contain. Wooden homes, shops, temples, all gone in seconds. Tanaka had seen death before. He had watched ships sink and planes burn. But this was different. This was annihilation without battle. Below, civilians ran through the streets, their silhouettes visible in the firelight. Some carried buckets of water. Others carried children. The rivers boiled with bodies. He could do nothing. No one could. The air raid command was silent. Communications cut. Anti-aircraft guns fired blindly into the inferno, their tracers vanishing in the smoke. Tanaka gripped the railing, heat washing over his face. He could hear the bombs falling even now, hundreds at a time, their whistling lost in the roar of the flames. "Sir," a young officer shouted behind him. "We have orders to evacuate. The western sector's collapsing." Tanaka turned, his voice hoarse. "Evacuate to where? There is no west. There is no city left." The officer hesitated, then saluted and ran. Tanaka looked skyward once more. Through the haze, he saw them. Silhouettes of B-29 essays gliding above the smoke. Perfect formation, their bellies glowing faintly from the fires below. They were calm, mechanical, unstoppable. He thought of Nakano and the other young pilots who had gone up earlier that night. None had returned. They had tried to intercept at low altitude, but the bombers came in waves, too many to count. Somewhere to the east, one of the aircraft exploded in midair, a rare hit from flak. The wreckage fell in flaming pieces into the city, cheered briefly by those still alive on the ground. But the cheers died quickly. For every bomber that fell, 50 more remained. By dawn, Tokyo was gone. Over 16 square miles reduced to ash. 100,000 people dead. The smell of smoke and burned wood lingered for days. When the sun rose, it shone not on a capital, but on a graveyard. The next week, Tanaka sat in the officers' barracks at Tachikawa, staring at his hands. His knuckles were still black with soot. Around him, the survivors of his squadron spoke in low voices. Some cried, others laughed hollowly. One of them, Captain Morita, broke the silence. "The Americans don't even bomb our factories anymore," he said bitterly. "They bomb our homes, our children." Tanaka looked up slowly. "Because they can." Morita frowned. "What do you mean? They can reach us anywhere, any time. They don't need to fight us. They just have to keep flying." He rose and walked to the window. Beyond the airfield, Tokyo still smoked on the horizon, a gray scar against the morning light. "Once," he said quietly, "we believed the ocean protected us, that the gods of the islands favored us. But the gods are gone. The sky belongs to the enemy now." Morita stared at him, uncomprehending. "You sound defeated." Tanaka turned, his eyes hollow. "No, Captain, I sound awake." Weeks passed, the raids continued. Osaka, Kobe, Nagoya, all suffered the same fate. Each night, the horizon glowed red. Each day, the airfields filled with ash and silence. By May, Japan's cities were barely recognizable. Railways stopped running. Civilians slept in tunnels and ruins. And still, the B-29S came. Tanaka flew when ordered, but he no longer believed in victory. His missions were acts of ritual, not war, brief, desperate climbs toward a sky that no longer belonged to them. The Americans didn't even need escort fighters anymore. The air over Japan was theirs, and yet, even amid the despair, there was something hauntingly beautiful about the Superfortress. Its design, its precision, its calm defiance of physics. It was not just a weapon. It was an idea that the war had already been decided, not by courage, but by industry. June 1945. Tanaka was assigned to the 47th Sentai, now based near Aomori. His new orders were simple: intercept any formation crossing from Iwo Jima. That evening, As he stood beside his aircraft, a mechanic approached, wiping his hands on a rag. "They say the Americans have a new bomb," he said quietly. "Something that can destroy an entire city with one strike." Tanaka managed a faint smile. "One bomb, one city. They don't need that. They already have 1,000. The mechanic hesitated, then nodded and walked away. Tanaka lit a cigarette, the flame flickering in the wind. Above him, the stars shone faintly through the haze. He thought of the first B-29 he'd ever seen, 2 years ago, gleaming silver against the morning sun, serene, unreachable. And he realized that everything since that day had been inevitable. The war hadn't ended with that first superfortress. It had begun to end. August 6th, 1945. Hiroshima. The morning broke clear and blue. One of those perfect summer days when the wind barely stirred the trees and the cicadas screamed from the rooftops. Children walked to school. Office clerks bicycled to work. The air raid sirens had been silent for days. Lieutenant Hiroshi Tanaka was hundreds of kilometers away, stationed at Aomori Air Base. He was drinking weak tea when the radio operator burst into the mess hall. "An explosion," the man gasped. "South, Hiroshima. Reports say the entire city. It's gone." The room went still. Tanaka set down his cup. "Gone? How do you mean gone?" The operator swallowed hard. "Not bombed, erased." Within hours, more reports trickled in. Wild, fragmented, unbelievable. A single aircraft, one bomb, a flash brighter than the sun. By evening, Tokyo Command confirmed it. The Americans had used a new weapon. The details were incomplete, but one thing was clear. No city had ever suffered such destruction. Tanaka sat on the edge of his bunk, staring at his gloves, the same way he had the night after seeing his first B-29. Only now, the feeling was different. Not shock, not fear. Something deeper. Recognition. He knew this was the end. For 2 years, he had watched Japan die piece by piece. From the factories to the ports, from the islands to the cities. He had seen the sky turn from a place of glory to one of judgment. And now, with a single bomb, the Americans had made that sky final. He looked out the window toward the west. The horizon was calm, deceptively beautiful. Somewhere beyond it, Hiroshima still burned. Nakano, his old wingman, entered quietly. "They say the Americans dropped it from a B-29. Tanaka nodded slowly. Of course they did. He rose and walked out onto the tarmac. The sun was setting, painting the clouds in deep crimson. A single contrail stretched across the sky, faint and fading. He remembered the first time he'd seen one, 2 years earlier over Kyushu. He had thought it beautiful then, a white thread of defiance across the heavens. Now it looked like a scar. 3 days later, August 9th, Nagasaki. Another flash, another city gone. By then, even the officers no longer pretended. The pilots sat beside their grounded planes, staring at the earth, waiting for the inevitable. That evening, Tanaka gathered his few remaining men in the hangar. Their aircraft, Ki 84S, worn and patched, sat lined in silence, wings streaked with oil and dust. "We've done our duty," he told them. "We fought for our country, our homes, our families. But we can't fight the sky." No one spoke. Some looked away, others stared at the ground. Tanaka lit a cigarette and exhaled slowly. The war will end soon. And when it does, remember this. We were not defeated by men or by courage. We were defeated by distance, by time, by what we could not reach. He looked up at the sky, now pale and still. And by the machine that conquered it. August 15th, 1945. The Emperor's voice came over the radio. Distant, trembling, otherworldly. The men gathered around the receiver, straining to understand the archaic language, the tone of surrender cloaked in formality. When the broadcast ended, no one spoke for several minutes. Then someone whispered, "It's over." Tanaka closed his eyes. For the first time in years, the air was quiet. No sirens, no engines, no explosions, just wind. He walked out onto the airfield. The grass had begun to grow through the cracks in the runway. His aircraft stood abandoned, its fuselage streaked with rust and rain. He ran a hand along its wing. The metal was cool, unfeeling. In the distance, the horizon shimmered with the soft light of evening. The sky, the same sky that had carried the bombers, the same sky that had carried his hopes, was calm again. He thought of all the men who had believed in that sky. The engineers who built their fighters, the commanders who swore victory from the clouds, the young pilots who never returned. All of it, undone by something simple yet vast. A new kind of flight, one beyond reach, one that turned the heavens into a weapon. He whispered to no one. When I first saw it, I knew. The first B-29 had not just been a machine. It had been a message. The world had changed that day. High above the clouds of Kyushu, the future had arrived, shimmering silver in the morning sun. A month later, under occupation, Tanaka stood on a hillside overlooking Tokyo. American trucks rumbled through the ruins below. Among them, parked neatly in rows, were several B-29s. Captured or grounded, their engines silent. He watched as American mechanics inspected them, laughing, smoking, taking photographs. The planes gleamed in the autumn light, their polished skin reflecting the world they had remade. One of the Americans noticed him watching and raised a hand in greeting. Tanaka nodded once, wordless. He understood now what the man's smile meant. Not arrogance, not mockery, but inevitability. The war had not been lost in the skies over Tokyo or Hiroshima. It had been lost the first time a Japanese pilot looked up and saw something he could not touch. That day in 1944, when the first Superfortress crossed into Japan's airspace, the future had revealed itself. And in that moment, high above the sea, where the sunlight turned metal to fire, Lieutenant Hiroshi Tanaka had known the truth. The war was already over.